Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Research Forum. It's really lovely to see so many of you here in person after all of these online events that we've had over the last few years. My name is Irene Brooke. I'm an associate lecturer here at the Courtauld, where I teach on the art of Renaissance Venice. And before I begin introducing tonight's speaker, I just want to mention an event next week here on the Research Forum. David Kim will be screening his new film, The Desert and the Lagoon, which is about Giovanni Bellini's Frick St. Francis. I think, Scott, this is our last Renaissance Research Forum event this year. So it should be wonderful, and you should all come back for that next week. Okay, so moving on to tonight's speaker. It's really a tremendous pleasure to be able to welcome Dr. Monika Schmitter, especially as she's come all the way from America. Monika is a professor and chair of the Department of Art History at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. She's held many fellowships throughout her career, just to name a few, a fellowship at ITATI, and also at the Center for Advanced Studies in the Visual Arts at the National Gallery in Washington. Most of you need no introduction to Monika's work, as her many pioneering studies on Venetian collecting, domestic art, and portraiture are well known. But in particular, I want to mention her important work on the uniquely kind of Venetian picture type known as the Quadro da Portogallo, painted facades, and cittadini collections. All of these have in many ways transformed our understanding of collecting practices in Venice and how these related to the domestic environment. Tonight, of course, she's going to talk about her recent book, The Art Collector in Early Modern Italy, Andrea Odoni and his Venetian Palace, which of course really builds on all of her previous work, especially her studies on Odoni's portrait and collection. But really, her book does much more than this, shedding light on social distinctions and class structure in Venice, questions of gender within domestic spaces, and more generally, the sort of functions and nature of portraiture in the period. Before handing over to Monika, I want to mention one other thing. She has an article coming out this year on Giorgione's Tempest in the journal Studies in Iconography. And given the really fascinating discussions of emblematic imagery and hieroglyphs in her new book, I, for one, can say that I'm very excited about this and seeing it in print. Without further ado, over to you, Monika.
Good evening, everyone. I have my tissues here, and I should get some water because I am apparently suffering from an allergy to the plane trees in London. So if I'm sneezing and coughing, I apologize. I'll do the best I can under the circumstances. So thank you, Irene, very much for that kind introduction, and thank you for inviting me to come and speak about my book. I'm so glad it worked out to do it in person. It was kind of back and forth, and not over Zoom. And I also want to thank Peter Humphrey for putting Irene and me in touch with one another. So the book came out last November. The title, which was chosen by the press, which is Cambridge University Press, and I have some flyers with the discount code if anybody's interested up here, the title might at first seem to oversell the book. In fact, the book is about a collector in early modern Italy. As the subtitle indicates, Andrea Odoni and his Venetian Palace. And in fact, I had a back and forth with the press about the size of the subtitle. They wanted to make it like almost unreadable. And I insisted that actually it was an important piece of information. But I've come to think that the title actually is quite good because I think Odoni is a very good, interesting example of what a collector might be in this place and time, and thus sheds light on the broader phenomenon of collecting. Not the least reason for this is that Odoni was one of the first men in Renaissance Italy to have himself represented in his portrait, above all, as a collector. By commissioning this depiction of himself from the painter Lorenzo Lotto, Odoni cemented his image, his identity, for posterity as a collector. And this is quite an unusual thing to do at a time when the very word collector, or collezionista in Italian, was not yet in use. So he's sort of picturing it even in some ways before the concept had fully been formed. In fact, the painting can be said to stand not only for Renaissance collector, but even for Renaissance man, more broadly, as is suggested by its use on the cover of a modern edition of Jacob Burckhardt's The Civilization of the Renaissance in Italy. I think I can say with some certainty that had Odoni not hired Lotto to paint quite such a magnificent portrait, and had the portrait not survived, I would not have written my book, and we would not be talking at such great length about Odoni today. The book has a three-pronged attack. First, there's the study of Odoni himself and who he was in early 16th century Venetian society. Second, it is a study of his house in Venice and where he displayed his collection in what we could think of as a quote-unquote house museum avant la lettre. Third, this is the study of the portrait itself, and the content or contribution of the book emerges out of the interactions between these parts. For the purposes of the talk this evening, I will only touch briefly on the first two prongs and concentrate on the third, the portrait. This is in part because I'm speaking in Odoni's current hometown. Since 1660, the painting has been part of the royal collection and is currently on display in the picture gallery at Buckingham Palace. And also because it is a work of art that you can look at least in reproduction, and think about what I'm saying while we are here together. In part, Andrea Odoni is an interesting example of a Venetian collector because he's an unexpected collector and a surprising subject for what I hope I will show you is an extraordinarily ambitious and intellectually provocative portrait. Odoni was not a member of the ruling elite in Venice, the so-called patricians or noblemen, who comprised about 5% of the population and were the only citizens who were enfranchised and able to hold political positions. Instead, Odoni was what was called a cittadino, which literally means citizen. As a social group in Venice, cittadini were distinguished, including by dress, from the larger popolo, the people, due to their wealth and social standing, but who by reason of birth were not part of the hereditary oligarchic ruling class. And this is a painting by Titian which shows them in the togas that they wore, which were the same togas that the patricians wore, and distinguished both classes from, the hoi polloi. So Odoni was the son of a wealthy immigrant from Milan who had become a Venetian cittadino by marrying a woman who belonged to that class. As a result, Odoni's maternal uncle, his name was Francesco Zio, or as I like to say, Zio, was a well-educated, well-connected cittadino who was himself an art collector. And in the book, I investigate the complex social dynamics of what it meant to be a cittadino during the period of Odoni's life, which is the first half of the 16th century. He was born in 1488 and he died in 1545. I would sum things up by saying that Odoni was both an insider and an outsider in Venetian society, and this helps to explain his alternatively conventional and experimental engagement with collecting. Odoni's lifetime was a period of significant political and social change in Venice when the city went from being a major player on the international political stage to instead fashioning itself as the last standing republic on the Italian peninsula, a cultural capital, and a relatively egalitarian society. Odoni was very much a man of this moment who understood what an investment in the other sense of cultural capital might accomplish in his adopted homeland. Odoni's house no longer survives, but its location can be determined, and on the left is the structure on the site today, very unassuming. The house was probably not that plain. We know, for example, that the balcony, which you see on the right, which is now on the palace of a different facade in a different part of the city, once was on Odoni's facade. But in any case, certainly Odoni's house was not architecturally magnificent, and it was not big. It was probably not much bigger than this house that is there. Nor was it in a very central location, as you see here on this map. It was off to the side. It's sort of in an area of Venice you would probably never go to. It's not far from the Piazzale in Roma, for those of you who know the city. So it was the contents of the house and the way they were put together, their presentation, that put Odoni and his family, and he was also working for his family. It was not a purely individualistic enterprise in that sense. He wanted to make a name for the family as well because they had been immigrants. So it was this house and its contents, what was in it, that brought visitors to the house, visitors who have left us documentary sources regarding the collection. One of these sources is a letter by the infamous writer Pietro Aretino. Addressed to Odoni, it recounts Aretino's visit to the house and what he saw there. The central conceit of the missive is that Odoni's house was essentially a portrait of Odoni himself, a three-dimensional counterpart to Lotto's likeness of Odoni, which Aretino surely saw there. Using Aretino's comment as a launching point, in the book, I reconstruct the different parts of Odoni's house and consider what they communicated about their inhabitant. The middle chapters of the book are thus a bit like a tour, if you like, of the house and the collection, focusing on Odoni's strategies of display and self-presentation, beginning with the facade, which was frescoed in color with figures of mythological gods by the painter Girolamo da Treviso. And this was once a common way of decorating the facades of palaces in Venice, which of course has not lasted very well, but I'm showing you here one example that still has some remnants of paint, so you have to use your imagination for what it would have looked like originally. Passing through the facade, one entered into a courtyard, which had ancient fragments and marble and modern sculpture that emulated ancient works of art, and in an ensemble that was intended to recall the garden museums that were popular in Rome during the period, such as the courtyard of the Casa Maffei, rendered here by Martin van Heemskerk. So the aim was to kind of have a bit of Rome, and in fact Aretino says that in the letter to Odoni. You know, I come to your palace and I feel, you know, as if I'm in Rome and in Venice at the same time. From there, one mounted stairs made of red Verona marble to the portico, the central display space of the Venetian home. Here, Odoni unusually displayed more sculpture, together with paintings of Christian and classical narrative scenes by artists such as Giovanni Cariani, Giovanni Girolamo Savoldo, and Bonifacio Veronese, among others. From the more public space of the portico reception hall, one could enter into the elaborately outfitted bedrooms referred to in the inventory as the Camera d'Oro, the golden room, and the Camera della Scala, the room of the staircase. And so this plan by Serlio gives you a sense, you know, you have the portico in the middle and you have these rooms that open off of the side. This is, you know, grander than Odoni's palace would have been, which only really had two principal fancy camere. So the first of these rooms was characterized by its attached studiolo. And here I'm showing you a painting by Carpaccio that depicts a religious subject, but it shows him in a kind of Venetian setting. And so this is probably the best image I can give you to give a sense of these little study rooms in the back there that you see through the open door that would have been off of the camere. So one room had a studiolo, and the other room had a very elaborate bed. They were sort of the dominant features. Works of art of various kinds ornamented both rooms, but one represented Odoni above all as a collector in a lineage of collectors. So alongside, it included in the studiolo objects like these. This is an actual 5th century ivory. Odoni owned at least one of those panels, maybe both. And then he also had sort of examples of naturalia, including what are described as bizarre fish. So I picked this image to illustrate bizarre fish. And in the camera itself, so those smaller objects were in the studio. In the camera itself, he also hung portraits of his uncle Zio by Vincenzo Catena. This is not necessarily the portrait, but it is a portrait by Vincenzo Catena. So the other room, on the other hand, foregrounded his appreciation of female beauty, including a Madonna and Child with a young St. John the Baptist and a female saint in a landscape by Titian. If it was not this painting in the National Gallery, it was one similar to that. There are sort of multiple versions of this painting. As is the case with this painting, very few works from Odoni's collection can definitively be identified. So I have necessarily engaged in degrees of conjecture to imagine the house and its contents. My method was attentive and intuitive reading of documents, not only of Odoni's house, but of other houses at the time, combined with careful study of works of art. And I'll give you just one example of this that I found particularly gratifying. So the inventory of Odoni's house, taken in 1555, lists a painting of a female nude in the calle-sella of the bedstead. A 19th century dictionary of the Venetian dialect defines a calle-sella as, quote, the space between the bed and the wall. Okay. The description of this location of Odoni's female nude has led many art historians to then claim that reclining Venuses painted by a variety of Venetian artists were originally displayed in bedrooms and associated with beds. So this is a very important kind of, in terms of the historiography of those Venuses, way that they've been contextualized based on the example of what we know from Odoni's collection. But it was only when I saw this elevation drawing of a bedroom in Sebastiano Serlio's overall plan for a Venetian house that I finally understood the term calle-sella. So on the right is that same plan I showed you before with the elevation details at the top there where you see C. On the upper left this is a detail here, and you can see C on the plan here, and I think you're looking at this, the elevation of that wall there. So when I saw this, it was like, aha, I think I understand what the calle-sella is, finally. So I think we can imagine a painting of a nude. Odoni's was by Savoldo, which is kind of a weird artist to have a nude by, but anyway. But I used this example by Girolamo da Treviso as a stand-in. So presumably it was, I think, either hanging here on this wall, and this is the calle-sella, or conceivably the calle-sella could have been the space between the bed and the back wall. And if that is the case, I've noticed in this painting by Saldama, this very elaborate bed where you see actually a mirror hanging between the bed and the back wall, or I think that's where it's hanging. in a similar possible location. So in either case, I think this implies a very intimate relationship between Odoni and his newt. Whether he admired her lying in bed, looking straight forward, or whether he turned to the side and curled up next to her, I think either way, you get the idea. So we also know from the inventory that the bed had very elaborate curtains made of embroidered yellow damask. And so these probably actually closed the nude off from public view, except when Odoni drew the curtain to reveal his work of art to discerning visitors, like the patrician Marcantonio Michel, about whom I'll say more momentarily. I have more to say about Odoni and his nude, if anybody wants to ask in the Q&A, and its relationship to the reclining female nudes in general. So it was in this room then, with the nude, and there was another image of a beautiful woman in there too. It was in this room that Odoni hung his portrait by Lotto. So when he emerged from behind the curtained bed, he would see his portrait on the wall, almost as if it were a mirror. Odoni commissioned the painting in 1527, and it's signed and dated, and up at there left there you can maybe make out the signature, and I've enhanced it in the bottom slide so you can see it more clearly. So Odoni would have been 39 years old, and at this point he obviously already wanted to be perceived as an antiquario, and that would have been the closest term to collector that was being used at that time, antiquario or antiquarian. But it doesn't exactly mean the same thing, but anyway, as antiquarian. But much of his investment in the house and collection actually came after the portrait, probably mostly in the 1530s. Possibly the process of commissioning the portrait and engaging with it daily shaped Odoni's further patronage and collecting. The painting provided an image with which to mirror and transform the self. Indeed, scholars have long known that the objects in the painting bear little relationship to Odoni's actual possessions, with the possible exception of the sculpted head in the foreground, which might depict the stucco bust of the Roman Emperor Hadrian that Odoni had on display in the portico alongside one of Hadrian's companion, Antinous. Although in my research, I have suggested a couple of other objects in the painting that might connect to Odoni's collection, for the most part, this is an imaginary collection. An ensemble concocted by patron and artist together to depict collecting as a means of transmuting the self, or of transforming a variety of materials into higher gold, quote unquote. The most important thing to understand about this portrait is its intense ambition. In his catalog of the Queen's collection, John Shearman noted many years ago that, quote, the picture is conceptually and psychologically more complex than a simple portrait of a collector. I would say it is not so much a portrait of a collector as it is a meta-commentary on the activity of collecting that just happens to be a portrait. Although at the same time, it is important that it's a portrait because it figures a relationship between selves or souls and between selves and soul or souls, material substances transformed by human God, that is works of art, and the ineffable divine. The innovations of the portrait can be summed up as three. I'm talking here about, the way that it is ambitious. And the three are interconnected. The most basic is the shape of the canvas on which Lotto painted, which is 104.3 centimeters tall and 116.8 centimeters wide. So it is slightly wider than it is tall, which if you think about, your average portrait is odd, right? Portraits are supposed to be vertical. These dimensions were new for a single sitter, having previously only been used for double portraits, such as this one by Raphael of two Venetians, one a nobleman on the left and the other a cittadino on the right. The effect is an enhanced mise en scène, not unlike a wider aspect ratio used in film. One can imagine a particular interior space with a window to the left that suffuses the room with light. The second innovation is the new style of painting that Lotto adapted when he moved back to Venice less than 2 years before. Although he was born in Venice, up to this point, Lotto had really not worked in his hometown. He came to Venice in 1525 from Bergamo, where he had made a name for himself with a crisper and more linear style. One of the portraits he executed in Venice, the early portrait, so this is, I'm sorry, that's a typo, it's 1526, so this one on the left, he painted just as he arrived in Venice, and it still shows the older style, whereas the Odoni portrait exhibits quite a bit more sfumatura, producing a greater sense of the integration of figure, objects, light, and atmosphere. This is Lotto responding to the more painterly, less linear style of Giorgione as passed on to the next generation of Venetian painters such as Titian and Palmavecchio. Speaking of whom, although Lotto drew inspiration from Venetian painters for his manner of handling paint after he moved there, he unquestionably also wanted to create his own brand of novelty. Both Titian's and Palma's portraits from the 1520s are decidedly vertical, not horizontal, and they do not convey much of a sense of interior space, and above all, they are very parsimonious when it comes to objects. Lotto and Odoni had other ideas about what a portrait might be and what it might accomplish. And the third innovation of the portrait is therefore the sheer quantity of objects that literally surround Odoni. So we have the format, the sort of experiment with a more sfumato style, and then also the, just the stuff all around him. The only comparable portrait from around the same time is not Venetian at all. It was painted in Parma, probably about 1524 by Parmigianino. Curiously enough, it is also in London. But Lotto's composition is more complex, an iteration of the idea of a painting with a sitter with objects that form a collection. The issue of what the connection is between these two paintings is still up in the air. I personally think that Lotto somehow knew the Parmigianino, but it's hard to prove. In fact, there are so many things to look at in Odoni's portrait, so many objects that cry out for interpretation, or at the very least identification, that scholars have paid relatively little attention to the man sitting in the center. With his bulbous nose, hooded eyes, robust beard, and head slightly inclined and turning, he is somewhat withdrawn in the middle ground of the picture. Engulfed in a dark blue, gray, black robe of the kind Venetian noblemen and citizens wore at home, he is a bulky presence. The gown is made of luscious fur-lined fabric, but its most distinctive feature are its sleeves, which have various openings to stick your arms out of depending on the weather and your activities. And you see two examples here of these sort of sleeves that have multiple exit strategies depending on what you happen to be doing and how hot it is. Right? Very handy. So Odoni used the gown, Lotto used the gown as the organizing hub of the painting. It creates the pyramidal form of Odoni at the center, while the white fur linings draw the eye in a circle around the composition from one object to the other. So I hope you can see the way that the white fur kind of helps to make the eye go around from one object to another. One sleeve, drastically foreshortened, creates swirls of fabric around the figurine in Odoni's right hand, while the other sleeve lies out like a third arm across the tabletop on the right. Together, the arms and sleeves reach out to us, almost as if to embrace us. Looking out towards us, Odoni extends one object to us, as if to, and holds another one to his chest. Lotto fashions the sense of an informal interaction in which Odoni welcomes us, the viewer, to examine his collection, much the same way he would have invited visitors to his house, like Aretino. One such visitor was the nobleman Marcantonio Michiel, the author of a manuscript now known as the Notizia d'Opera di Disegno. Much of what we know about Odoni's house and the works of art it contained, particularly the names of the artists and often the subjects of the works of art, comes from Michiel's notes. And you see the manuscript open to Odoni's collection on the top there. He saw the portrait in the Camera della Scala, and although he only wrote one line about it, which you see there on the bottom, his carefully chosen words provide an apt guide to interpreting the painting. And we see in the manuscript, and here you're going to have to take my word for it because, as you can see, it's not so easy to read. There are a lot of abbreviations, and the ink is bleeding through from the other side of the page. But what he wrote originally was that the picture depicted Odoni con, or with, ancient marble fragments, but then he crossed out con with, and he wrote in above the line, just right here, que contempla, who contemplates. So the line now reads that the painting shows Odoni who contemplates ancient marble fragments. Now this may not seem like a huge change, but actually the word contemplate is very significant. Michiel employed the word repeatedly in his writings to indicate the practice of observing art or beauty in the world as a means to spiritual enlightenment. And one also finds it used that way by other 16th century writers such as Baldassare Castiglione and in fact Lotto himself. So what Michiel suggests that the works are not just with Odoni, but rather that they function as a conduit to a process of thought or devotion that transcends materiality. I don't have time in this presentation to consider all the works of art that Lotto included in the painting. That's why I've written the book. In the book, I also connect the choice of objects to the artist Lotto's intertwining interests in metaphors drawn from alchemy, religious reform in the era of the Reformation, and the Renaissance understanding of hieroglyphs as an emblematic picture language. But I will briefly identify the objects and tell you that I understand all of them to be iterations or reflections on the principal tenet put forth at the center of the painting. Odoni is the core of the painting, and the objects are like satellites around him, or like spokes of a wheel that lead back to the hub. Placed in a special position on the upper left is a painted version of a sculpture that Lotto actually saw in the Belvedere collection at the Vatican of antiquities, and the drawing in the middle is a drawing almost certainly by Lotto. It corresponds very closely with the version in the painting, and the sculpture is now restored, but it's still at the Vatican. A second figure of Hercules also derives from another statue in the Vatican courtyard, which was then believed to depict the Emperor Commodus in the guise of Hercules, and that's the one to the right of Odoni. And on the far right, statues are painted to look like bronze, and they depict a third Hercules of the type known as Hercules mingens, and Lotto has placed the diminutive figure so that he appears to urinate into the vase on which a figure of Venus washes her feet. Lotto's having a bit of fun here. I think he thinks it's funny. I don't know if it's that funny, but anyway. But he's also using the figures to make visual puns on his name, something he really liked to do, and I call them his hieroglyphic signatures. Lotus, the Latin form of lotto, is the past participle of the Latin verb lavo, meaning washed. So while the Latin, so she's washing, while the Latin word lotium, urine, was often abbreviated in alchemical texts as lot. And so Lotto is using both these puns. He used these puns in other works as well, and he's combining them here together. And I'm sure he thought he was really had outdone himself by accomplishing this. So below these figures are, to the foreground from the figures, are what I identify as a translucent blue and white porcelain bowl, a type of object that Odoni did actually own, and pearls loosened on a string. Both objects are made from translucent white substances of high value and were the subjects of both alchemical investigations and Christian spiritual metaphors. Directly in front of Odoni on the table lie a small book of hours, its ties unbound, and also haphazardly strewn silver and bronze coins. Both, again, types of objects that Odoni did own. Their position suggests that we have interrupted Odoni as he has been contemplating a Christian devotional text alongside ancient coins. One of the stranger passages in the painting, which has quite a few strange passages actually, is the two marble fragments in the foreground, the male portrait head and the headless female nude torso. She looks very much like a surviving ancient statue that ended up in the collection of Marco Mantova Benevides in the late 16th century in Padua, and it remains there today. The sculptures lean against one another, rather preposterously lifting up the green tablecloth as if emerging from under the furniture. These, I interpret, following the work of the Italian scholar Mauro Zanchi, as a metaphor for the alchemical relationship between body and spirit that is key to transmutation. So I've given you a hint here and there about my reading of the various satellite objects, but I want now to focus on the two objects that Odoni is holding in his hands, which are obviously the most, or holding close to him, let's say. So the one outstretched to us and the other held to his hand, this is the gesture that Lotto often used in his works to indicate the concept, like, this is dear to me. Right? So the object in Odoni's right hand has long been identified as a representation of Diana of Ephesus, which is an extremely redolent image, and I'll return to that. In the other hand, he holds up an object that has only relatively recently been rediscovered. It was earlier thought that Odoni was only holding his hand to his chest, but in a cleaning in 1996, Rupert Featherstone discovered that in the last restoration, or the previous restoration in the 1950s, they had, for whatever reason, painted out the gold crucifix that was in Odoni's leg. So this shows you what it looked like before. It was not at all clear that it was a crucifix. And as a result, the 20th century literature on the portrait does not take the cross into account, and only relatively recently have scholars come to terms with the very strong juxtaposition of these two objects in Odoni's hand. One, a classical goddess explicitly associated in the Bible with idolatry. The other, a representation of Christian faith in the form of Christ crucified. The tendency has been to see the objects in opposition, that Odoni in some way indicates that despite his interest in ancient idols, he nonetheless is a good Christian. I do not, however, agree that the painting has an apologetic tone. Odoni lived surrounded by ancient sculptures, and modern statuary meant to look like ancient statuary, and Lotto shows him surrounded by them in the portrait. I don't think that there is a negation going on here of the other objects. It is true that statues of Diana of Ephesus are mentioned in the Acts of the Apostles in relation to St. Paul's attacks on the pagan worship of idols. Revealingly, the passage recounts the concerns of artisans who worry that they will lose their livelihoods as a result of these newfangled ideas. This would have been a very topical subject for an artist like Lotto, making religious images at the time of the Protestant Reformation in a city where the polemics of the reformers were being taken especially seriously. Reform movements that Lotto himself was quite sympathetic to. I think there's no question that Lotto is thinking here about the notion of the idol, reflecting upon the use of image in religious practice by the ancients and the moderns. At the time Lotto painted the portrait, ancient statues of Diana of Ephesus had only recently been discovered, like this one. Raphael painted one of the first representations of her in Renaissance art on the ceiling of the Stanza della Signatura, and actually Lotto was Raphael's assistant in the Vatican rooms. In this context, as in other early 16th century images and texts, and I could bring in multiple examples of this, but I'm not going to do that, the figure was understood to represent, quote, the idea or goddess of nature, and was associated with the Egyptian goddess of wisdom, Isis, who was conflated in late antiquity with Diana of Ephesus. A particularly revealing example of this use of Diana of Ephesus to represent nature is Benvenuto Cellini's drawing and text proposing a design for the seal of the Florentine Accademia del Disegno. This is in the British Museum. Notably, the subject here is art, or more precisely, the relationship between art and nature. And Cellini writes, design, disegno, is truly the origin and principle of all the actions of men. And true, why do I have something strange going on here? And I think I meant, the true idea della natura, okay, it's just bad translation. Idea della natura, and the word here combines dea and idea, right? The true idea della natura was represented by the ancients with many breasts in order to signify that she alone nourishes everything as the unique and principal ministress of God. This idea of nature as the mistress of God is not original to Cellini, but he plays on it nicely here with his image of the idea della natura. I argue that Odoni does not offer his idea della natura as the antithesis of Christ, but rather, or also, as Cellini puts it, as the unique and principal ministress of God, the conduit through which we might, like Odoni, come to contemplate the divine, to use Michael's word. In Lotto's portrait, nature, in the form of a work of art, even an idol, is extended to us, but it leads us back to the object in Odoni's other hand, the gold crucifix. Although the crucifix is much smaller than the other sculptures, it is made of gold, the highest substance, according to alchemical metaphors that Lotto was familiar with. It is nonetheless itself also a work of art, a work of goldsmithery. It is a crucifix, not a cross. In this painting, Lotto depicts many different natural substances: stone, bronze, porcelain, pearls, parchment, silver, even wool, animal fur, human skin and hair that are transformed, one might even say transmuted, through human intervention into works of art. The painting is about that transformation, that transmutation, and how all those transformations lead one to the contemplation of Christ at the center of the painting. Succinctly put, the painting is a manifesto about collecting as a transcendent activity and about works of art as a means to contemplate the divine. But there is an open-ended approach here. This is not a painting that makes declarative statements. The pagan idols are not rejected. They, like the gold crucifix around Odoni's neck, like any Christian image, are pathways to something higher, something immaterial. In this regard, I connect Lotto's portrait to what Alexander Nagel has called soft iconoclasm. While Italy did not experience the outright iconoclasm that occurred in Northern Europe at this very time, Nagel draws attention to what he calls iconoclastic impulses that emerge within works of art themselves. Lotto's painting is, of course, not strictly speaking a religious work of art. It is a portrait, but the image forces us to confront forms of idolatry, but I think it proposes an ecumenical solution. All images, pagan or Christian, are objects of contemplation that may lead the soul, in this case Odoni's in particular, but also any viewer of Lotto's painting, to recognize that they are all potentially stepping stones to the divine. In this talk, I hope I have shown just how right John Shearman was when he proposed that Odoni's likeness was much more than just a portrait of a collector.